Snow had begun its slow descent before she reached the first rise above Ash Hollow. The sky lay low and colorless, the kind of sky that pressed a weight upon the earth and promised no warmth until spring. Mara Ellison drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the wind clawed through wool as if it were lace. Her horse blew steam into the dusk, its ears twitching at the sound of distant hammering and the muted hum of a town bedding down. For night, she had not seen these plains in 6 years. In her memory, they had seemed wider, warmer stretched beneath a sun that bled copper across the grass. Tonight they were iron and ash, a land worn raw by winter. The wagon creaked behind her, heavy with all she owned. A rocking chair that once sat on a porch now burned. A chest of linens yellowed with age, and a rifle that had not spoken in 2 years, but still remembered the sound of men dying. The first lamp winked through the snowfall as she reached the edge of Ash Hollow. It was little more than a scatter of buildings clinging to the earth's saloon light, bleeding through batwing doors. Smithy dark and silent, smoke rising from a line of sawdrift cabins hunkered low against the wind. Her name had passed through this town before her. She felt it in the hush that met her boots on the boardwalk, in the sideways glances that slid over her like a blade. Inside the saloon, heat swelled thick with tobacco and sweat, a stark contrast to the gnawing cold outside. Men hunched over their cups, shadows dancing long on the plank walls. Conversation faltered as the door swung shut behind her. She felt the weight of their eyes, not curious, not kind, just heavy. A woman alone, riding in from nowhere with the look of someone who'd crossed more than miles. The barkeep's gaze met hers, flat as a winter pond. "Evenin'," he said, though the word bore no welcome. She asked for coffee, though whiskey might have been wiser. He poured in silence, slid the tin cup across the scarred counter. His eyes drifted to the rifle slung over her shoulder, lingered, then moved on like a man deciding not to touch an old scar. Behind her, chairs scraped. A low murmur curled through the smoke words she couldn't catch, though one rose clear as a bell. Canyon. She kept her chin level, fingers tight around the cup. Heat burned her palms, but it could not reach the hollow in her chest. They remembered, of course they did. The story had traveled far on winds that carried lies faster than truth. 10 men rode that night, so the tale went. Men into the canyon after her wagon, only one returned, torn open by bullets in terror, crying for his mother like a child. What the story left unsaid, they had filled in with venom. Some called her witch, some worse. No one ever asked her what happened beneath that black sky. No one wanted to know the truth of how a woman lives when the world sets its teeth to her. Throat, the barkeep's voice broke the silence like a branch snapping. "You'll find no easy ground here, Mrs. Ellison." He spoke her name soft, as if it tasted strange. "Plains don't take kindly to folks carrying old storms." She let the words settle, then nodded once. "I aim to buy supplies." Dots. All coins clinked against the wood, every cent she'd saved since she buried her sister back east. Flour, salt, a bit of coffee, enough to keep breath in her body while she made a place of her own. The council held the deed to the land her husband had once bled for. Whether they'd sell to her, she couldn't know. But she had come too far to turn back now. When she stepped outside, the wind had turned sharp, driving snow in hard slants. Across the dark, stung her cheeks, whispered against her shawl. She loaded the sacks into the wagon with stiff fingers, the creak of leather and the groan of wheels loud in the hush. Behind her, laughter rose from the saloon-thin brittle, like glass ready to break. She mounted up and turned toward the open flats, where the world was nothing but white and shadow. The horse snorted, hooves crunching through crusted snow. With each step, Ash Hollow faded behind her, its glow shrinking to a pinprick in the storm. Ahead lay miles of emptiness, a cabin abandoned, and a future no warmer than the wind at her back. Mara kept her eyes forward, though the cold gnawed her. Bones and silence pressed like a stone upon her heart. If there was mercy left in this land, it would not be given, it would be taken. Carved out by hands that had known blood and sorrow, and still reached for something like hope. And so she rode on, alone beneath a sky that had forgotten her name, carrying nothing but the weight of survival and the stubborn will to plant her roots where no kindness would grow. The road to the homestead was little more than a scar through the plains, faint and broken beneath drifts of snow. The wagon wheels groaned, their rims sheathed in frost. And Mara drove on until the land began to lift and dip, shallow folds of earth shaped by wind and old grief. When she first saw the cabin, her breath caught not from beauty, for there was none, but from the way it hunched against the slope like a wounded animal refusing to die. The door leaned on one hinge. The windows were blind with grime. A smoke had not risen from that chimney in years, yet it stood, and that was more than most things in her life. She tied the horse to a bare-limbed cottonwood and stepped inside, the sound of the latch snapping behind her like a verdict. Cold lived in those walls, an old bitter cold that had seeped into the bones of the place. Dust lay thick as muslin across the floorboards. On the hearth, ashes curled like dead moths. Her boots creaked as she moved from room to room too, that was all. One narrow bed frame sagged in the corner, iron rails rusting. A rocking chair stood near the window, its runners worn smooth by years of patient motion. When the wind shifted, it creaked, slow and spectral, as if the ghost of some tired mother still rocked her babe. She found more relics, scattered in shadows, a child's shoe tucked behind the stove, a blue ribbon gone pale, a broken clay cup. On the shelf, lives had bloomed here once, bright and warm as a spring dawn, then blown away like chaff. Now only silence kept vigil, and the hollow sound of wind worrying the eaves. Mara set her jaw and began to make the place hers. She patched the roof with tarred canvas, stuffed rags in the gaps between the logs, coaxed a flame in the hearth until smoke twisted up the flue like a black prayer. By nightfall, the cabin breathed a thin warmth. She unrolled her bedding by. The fire brewed bitter coffee in a dented pot and ate hard biscuits softened in water. Her hands ached with the work, but her mind ached worse with memory. When darkness settled and the wind keened low, she drew her shawl tight and sat before the flames, mending what little she owned. Needle through cloth, draw and knot. The rhythm should have soothed her, but her thoughts strayed to a laugh she had not heard in 6 years, the laugh of a man broad in the shoulders. His voice warm as honey poured slow. Sam Ellison. He'd once carried her across a creek when the current ran strong, boots dripping, hat askew, grinning as if the world were all their own. She had loved him fierce and certain, the way a root loves the soil. Then outlaws took him. Down in a spray of dust and gunfire, and the soil had given nothing back. She left the West after that, running east with grief like a brand on her skin. But grief follows, and when her last bloodkin lay under the earth, she turned her face west again because there was nowhere else to go. Only this. She bent over her mending, breath shallow. The fire popped. Shadows lengthened across the floor, like grasping hands. And the past came back as it did most nights, when the world lay still. A night black as coal smoke, canyon deep as sin, and the sound of hooves rolling like distant thunder. 10 men. She saw their faces still, rough with hunger and want, teeth flashing in the dark. They came fast, rifles gleaming, voices sharp with laughter. Her wagon carried freight flour, salt, a barrel of nails nothing worth dying for, yet death came. All the same, she had one rifle and a heart pounding like a drum of war. She remembered the smell first gunpowder, and sweat tanned, then the noise.
How nice.
Louder than storms, until the air split and screams ripped through the night. They did not expect her to fight. They never do. When the echo faded and the blood soaked cold into the dirt, she was still standing. Barely. Her shoulder burned where the rifle's kick had bruised her deep. 10 men rode in, at dawn. Only one crawled out in his belly, bleeding. Eyes wild as a cornered wolf. He said he cried for his mother. She wouldn't know. She never looked back. No one asked her what happened. They wrote their own gospel, temptress, which outlaws whore. They carved the words deep as any gravestone, and she carried them like stones in her pack. Truth was simpler, colder. A woman did what she must to live, and sometimes the price was paid in blood. She laid the mended cloth aside, staring into the fire until her vision blurred. Flames leaped and fell, like the rise and fall of men under a rifle's report. She pressed her hands to her eyes, but the red behind her lids was worse because it was the red of memory, and there was no unseeing it. Outside, the wind rose, prowling around the cabin, rattling the shutters like a restless soul. The rocking chair creaked once, slow and mournful, though she had not touched it. Mara lifted her head and looked at that empty seat, and for a breath she thought she saw a shadow there slight, childlike, but when she blinked it was gone. Just a chair, old wood, nothing more. Still, she spoke into the hush, her voice low. Raw against the dark. Not yet, she said. You can haunt me later. The fire whispered back, soft as breath, and Mara drew her shawl tight. Ghosts were patient. They would wait. For now she had living to do, and the living was harder than the dead. The storm swallowed the plains in silence first, then found its voice a long, low howl that rose like wolves hunting the edges of the night. Mara barred the shutters and stoked the fire high, listening to snow hurl itself against the cabin walls. The wind pressed like an uninvited hand on the door. Each gust made the old timbers groan and the rocking chair shiver in its corner. She drew her shawl close and sat with her mending, though the needle quivered in her fingers. There was no horizon anymore, no shape of earth or sky, just white, devouring white. It was near dark when the sound came. Hooves, faint, then closer, muffled under drifts, but steady as a heartbeat. Mara stilled. Few rode in storms like this, none without reason. She laid the cloth aside, reached for the rifle by the hearth, and moved to the door on silent boots. When she opened it, the gale tore in, stinging her face with ice. Out of that, blind swirls staggered a horse, sides lathered, steam writhing from its body like breath from the earth itself. The man astride it swayed in the saddle, hat crusted with frost, coat stiff as bark. His head lifted at the sight of her ghosts. Movement slow and spare. His eyes, pale gray, found hers for the span of a heartbeat before closing again, as if the storm had taken even that strength. "Ma'am," he rasped, voice stripped to sinew. "Beg, shelter. Horse went lame. Storm caught me. No plea. No drama, just the plain truth, worn thin as his body." Mara stepped back, leaving the door wide for him in the bitter night. "Bring him in if you can," she said, and vanished into the white to seize the horse's reins. Together they dragged the beast to the lean-to, blanketed its quivering flanks, rubbed warmth into the cold leather of its hide. By the time they shut the cabin door, her skirts were rimmed with ice, and his coat dripped melt in a steady patter on the planks. He stood near the hearth, tall but bent with wear, steam rising from him like smoke. His hair, what showed beneath the hat, was dark, streaked with iron. His beard hid most of his face, but not the hollows cut deep by wind and want. He looked like a man carved from the same earth he'd been riding, over-scarred, enduring, stripped. "Of all softness, name's Elias Turner," he said, rough as gravel, hat in his hand now, obliged for the fire. Mara studied him in silence. Names meant little. She nodded once, set the rifle back by the hearth, and ladled coffee into a tin cup. When she passed it to him, his fingers brushed hers, ronicled, cold as creek stone. He murmured thanks and crouched by the flames, the light glancing off a revolver worn thin at the edges. They spoke little while the storm clawed the walls. Words felt brittle here, liable to splinter in the wrong wind. Instead, their silences filled the room, weighted with things neither dared name. Mara sat in the rocker, shawl drawn close, needle idle in her lap. Elias hunched on the hearthstones, boots steaming, eyes fixed on the fire, as if it held the map of some country long lost. She noticed how his left hand trembled when the wind moaned low in the chimney, the tremor running like a shadow through his stillness. He noticed the scars that ridged her knuckles, white against skin browned by years of sun. Marks made by rope or rifle, he could guess which. Outside, the storm deepened. Snow drove against the cabin like fists. The night pressed close as water. In a well, and the only sound was the hiss of wind and the soft groan of old wood. The fire cracked, throwing light across their faces as worn like a weathered trail. Hers pale but strong eyes, the color of dry earth after rain. When at last they spoke, it was of small things, the storm, the horse, the bitter coffee cooling between them. His voice carried the flat cadence of an army man once drilled into silence and endurance. Hers was low, even as if each word cost her more than coin. Either asked the questions that coiled behind their teeth. Who are you running from? Ghosts do you carry? The answers lay between them, heavy as snow on the roof. Night stretched long. When Mara lay down on her pallet, the storm still raged, rattling shutters like bones. She closed her eyes and saw it again, the canyon, black as a well, the flare of rifles tearing the dark. Men shouting, hooves screaming, braids swinging from a saddle horn. She smelled blood in the dust, sharp as iron. She woke with the taste of it on her tongue, breath harsh, shawl twisted in her fists. Firelight trembled on the ceiling like the ghosts of flames past. Across the room, Elias stirred. He had taken the rocker, boots braced wide, revolver within reach. His eyes opened. In the half-light, gray as dawn before a killing frost. He did not speak, did not ask. Just rose, slow and quiet, fed the fire another log, and set the rocker moving again. Its creak soft as the whisper of an old hymn. Mara turned her face to the wall and willed the dream back into its hole. But the sound of the chair followed her, into the dark, steady as a heartbeat not her own, reminding her of something she feared more than wolves, that for the first time in years she was not alone. The storm did not break on the second day, nor the third. It pressed down with the patience of God's own judgment, laying the world under white until even the trees bowed their heads. The cabin seemed smaller with each hour, walls sweating. With fire, heat, air thick with silence, they rationed coffee to bitter sips, venison jerky to thin strips softened over flame. Ether complained. Words were spent like coin here, careful and rare. Elias kept to work when the wind gave pause. He fixed the hinge on her door without asking, set his knife to shaping a splintered rail. Mara watched from the rocker, shawl drawn tight, needle flashing as she mended the tear along his coat sleeve. The cloth bore stains older than this storm rust dark, and stiff where blood had dried seasons ago. She did not ask whose it was. He did not speak thanks. But when the thread drew tight, his gray eyes lifted to hers, and in that glance lay something quieter than gratitude, heavier than words. The rifle stayed near. She kept it loaded even at dawn. Elias saw but said nothing, same as she said nothing when a sudden crack in the wood made his shoulders jerk as if shot. Some wounds did not bleed on the outside. That night was snow still. Clawing at the shutters, he found her by the hearth, the rocker groaning like old bones. A chest sat open at her feet, cedar darkened with age. Inside lay a folded dress silk, gone yellow at the creases, lace fraying like frost on glass. It looked less like a garment than a corpse, something buried in cloth and memory. Her hair had slipped loose from its knot, falling like black rope down her back, gray whispering at the roots. Firelight trembled on her cheekbones, hollowed by long winters. He stopped short, not for modesty, but for the weight in her gaze when she lifted her head. Shadows brimmed her eyes like water in a deep well. You ever lose someone? Her voice held no tremor, only the flatness of earth gone hard with drought. Elias crouched slow, his knees cracking like thawing timber. He did not look at her, only at the fire, and for a long moment the flames seemed to speak louder than any man. When at last he answered, it came low, as if the words had worn down to their last edge. Everyone worth keepin'. The room held still after that. Even the wind seemed to draw breath and weight. Between them lay the chest, the dress, the years. Loss sat with them like a third soul, silent and hungry. A sound broke at a howl, slicing through the dark, long and raw. Coyote, maybe. Something. Leaner, meaner, that hunger had sharpened to bone. Elias rose and crossed to the door, listening with his head bent, hand resting near the revolver on his belt. Mara did not move from the chair, only watched the fire dance in his eyes as if measuring what manner of man he was. The howl died to nothing, leaving the world hollow as a grave. He let out a breath deep and slow, then turned back. Their gazes, caught like two flints struck together. No spark spoken, only the promise of heat buried deep where neither dared dig yet. Inside, silence thickened again, but it was no longer empty. It hummed low and fragile, like fire coaxed from wet wood, a warmth that might live if they fed it slow and careful. If the wind didn't snuff it first. The thaw came slow, creeping out of the earth like something half ashamed. First the drifts thinned to gray seams, then the flats turned to mud, sucking at boots, swallowing tracks. Wind lost its teeth, though the cold still held on, crouching in the shadows. With the storm gone, the world seemed wider, emptier, and meaner for it. Hunger had a way of breeding men worse than wolves. They came at dusk. 4 of them, maybe 5 shapes on the horizon that slid from haze like ghosts until the sun threw bronze on their rifles. Young, all of them, with hunger in their eyes and braids tied loose like trophies they had no right to wear. Their ponies churned the flats, kicking slush and spite, circling slow as buzzards. Laughter carried on the wind-sharp raw, hungry for something to break. Mara stood by the hearth when she heard them. She froze, shawl slipping from her shoulders, breath snagging in her throat. Not for fear, not only that. Memory came down like a black wing, thick with gun smoke and blood. 10 men, one returned. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles bleached white. Elias had already stepped to the door. He stood easy, rifle hanging low in his hand, but his body was coiled, still as a cat before the spring. He glanced back once, eyes meeting. Hers not for permission, just to let her know what was coming. Outside, the air tasted of iron and thaw. Walked to the edge of the porch, boots sucking in mud, and planted himself like a fence post in the teeth of the wind. The riders slowed their circling eyes, narrowing at the sight of him, a tall man. Scar across his jaw, coat torn but hanging square, rifle glinting dull in the last scrap of sun. "Evenin'," he called, voice level, carrying easy. "Best ride on." A laugh answered a harsh bark from a boy with no beard yet. His hand drifted down, slow and stupid, to the butt of his iron. Elias didn't wait. The shot split the world, sharp as a breaking bone. Smoke curled from the rifle's mouth, blue in the dusk. The boy pitched sideways, boot catching in the stirrup, so his body dragged half a length before the pony bolted. The others scattered like leaves in a flood, yipping curses that tore ragged against the sky. Their laughter was gone now, lost under the pounding of hooves. In a breath, the flats were empty, but for blood soaking into thawed earth and the echo of that one hard crack. Elias stood still a long moment, watching the horizon swallow them whole. Then he turned, slow as a man carrying stones in his chest, and came back inside. Mara hadn't moved. She stood rooted, eyes fixed on the door as if the wind might bring those riders back, core ghosts older still. When she finally spoke, her voice rasped like a dry creek bed. 10 men, she said. Her hands were fists at her sides, shaking. They came out of the canyon that winter, took the wagon, the stock, took what they thought they could. Her breath hitched. She bit it down like a bit, had one rifle. She broke off, stared at the floorboards as if the words were buried there. I fired till my shoulder near tore loose. Fired till I couldn't hear my own name. The sun came, there was blood everywhere. Mine, theirs. I crawled out of it. I lived because no one else was going to pull me out. The room held still as snow before it falls. Elias set the rifle down by the wall, leaned it careful, then crossed to her. He didn't speak right off. Just stood there, his shadow folding over hers, like a long road meeting another. When he finally did, his voice was low, steady, worn, smooth as river stone. "Then you're stronger than most men I've known." The words fell quiet, but they struck deep. Mara's breath shivered loose. Her hands trembled now, not with fear, but with the breaking of some long-fastened lock inside her. She didn't try to hide it. Couldn't. Elias reached, slow as sunrise, and took those hands in his. They were cold, work-worn, scarred hands that had killed, hands that had mended, hands no one had held in years. He cradled them like something sacred, something that might break if he held too hard or too loose. Firelight spilled over them both, painting their shadows long and close on the cabin wall. Two shapes, leaning toward each other as the night thickened and the wind went soft against the eaves. Outside, the flats lay empty, blood darkening the thawed earth. Inside, another kind of heat stirred a fragile thing, born in gunsmoke and silence, coaxed alive by the quiet trust of two souls, too tired to lie anymore. They said nothing because nothing needed saying. Some truths were best spoken in the hush between heartbeats, in the slow weight of hands that promised more than any vow could hold. Spring came on quiet feet, soft as a prayer whispered under breath. Snow was gone, leaving the flats slick with melt, stitched with the first threads of green. Grass bent in the wind like women in church, their heads bowed to something older. Then time. Above, the sky spread clean and blue as a baptism. They rode side by side, two shadows long in the morning light. Elias upright in the saddle, coat hanging like old armor, rifle slung easy across his back. Mara beside him, shawl pulled close, though the chill had broken. Her hair coiled neat save for a single strand, the wind kept lifting to her cheek. They spoke little on the trail. Words seemed thin out here, where silence had weight, and everything that mattered was carried in a glance. Ash Hollow rose out of the flats the way all towns do, a smear of smoke first, then rooftops hunkered low against. The wind, the streets were mud-rutted, glossed by thaw, men's boots and horse hooves grinding the last of winter into the earth. Folks stopped to watch as they rode in. Elias felt their eyes, cold and measuring, but not without respect now.
Man who
Consent raiders scattering earns a kind of reverence out here, whether asked for or not. Mara felt them too, those eyes sharp as nails. But where once they burned her like shame, now they barely raised a scar. Let them look. She had walked out. Of worse than whispers, the council waited in the meeting hall, its walls smelling of lamp oil and sweat. Men sat stiff as fence rails, faces carved from suspicion. Mara stood straight before them, hands folded at her waist, voice low but steady as she laid out her claim. The land her husband had sweated for, the dream he'd died before touching. They shifted, muttered, made a show of the rules, but in the end, they signed. They could not take the steel from her spine, nor the deed from her fingers, once ink had dried, to pay for it. She slid a small object across the tabla brooch. Silver dulled with years, the last keepsake of a life gone under. She did not flinch as they weighed it like coin, did not look away as they passed her the paper. Some things cost more than gold, some things are worth the price. Outside the day had turned. Clouds split like old wounds and sun spilled down, molten, striking the flats till they shone as if the earth itself had caught fire. Elias waited by the horses, hat brim shadowing his eyes. When she came down the steps, the paper clutched in her hand, he tipped that hat slow, and the edge of a smile tugged at his mouth. "You ever think of startin' again?" he asked, voice carrying that lazy drawl that masked nothing of its weight. She met his eyes then, and whatever answer lived in her chest was too big for words. She gave him a look instead, deep as river water. Holding winter's ache and spring's first breath all in one, they swung into the saddle, the leather creaking, soft as an old hymn, and turned their horses toward the horizon. Behind them, Ash Hollow shrank to a smudge in the sun's glare. Ahead, the flats stretched wide and waiting, the air sharp with thaw and promise. Mara glanced once over her shoulder, then forward again. The wind teased the edge of her shawl, warm now against her back. For the first time in years, the weight in her chest eased, and something new took its place. Not joy, not yet, but peace. The kind you carve with your own hands. The kind stitched with scars. The kind no man can grant and no world can take away. Beside her, Elias rode easy, a shadow long and steady at her flank. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full enough to live in, full enough to build on a house made of quiet and trust, set deep in soil that had known blood and now knew green. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold on their path, and they kept riding. Two figures, worn thin by storm and hunger, bound by something stronger than either had sought, not because they were whole, but because together they might be more than what the world had left behind.